Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Joey Ayoub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Bram Büscher. He's the author of the book The Truth About Nature, Environmentalism in the Era of PostTruth Politics and Platform Capitalism. As you may know by now, I've been trying to do a number of episodes on how to think about climate change. Obviously, this is something that's on everyone's minds, especially given the recent wildfires, droughts, floods, and so on. But the subject that we get into here may sound very specific at first, because we try to understand what it means to not just think about climate change, but what does it mean to actually do something about it? And even more specifically, what does it mean to do something about climate change in the era of quote-unquote post-truth and platform capitalism? Given that so much of our mediascape today, and so much of our world, is regulated by these big platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Google, TikTok, and so on. How has that impacted the way we deal with the topic of climate change? Has it, as many people believe, facilitated communication around climate change? Has it made it easier for people to become quote-unquote aware? Does that make a difference? And if yes, how so? And if no, why? These are just some of the questions that we ask in this conversation. So although we do focus on the big platform corporations, I think this is a conversation that goes beyond that, as with so many of the episodes on this podcast. And as usual, I would love to hear from you, your thoughts, feedback, criticism, and so on. So feel free to contact me either on Patreon or by email, which you can find on the website. Take care, folks.
My name is Bram Büscher, and I'm a professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. But I also hold visiting positions at the University of Johannesburg and the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And I'm currently in Stellenbosch on a 6-month sabbatical with the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, working on my new project on sort of the political economy of biodiversity in the 6th extinction crisis. My work mainly and broadly looks at the political economy of environmentalism and conservation. So I try to look at human-nature relations from different angles. I've studied transboundary protected areas, or so-called peace parks, the relation between fossil fuels and conservation, so-called instances of green violence, where the urge to protect nature is becoming increasingly violent, and also the relation between digital technologies and nature. And that's basically the topic of my most recent book, The Truth About Nature.
Yeah, and so the most recent book will be the primary topic of this conversation. I've been thinking about the topic itself that you get into the book, and for the record, as you mentioned, it's called The Truth About Nature, Environmentalism in the Era of Post-Truth Politics and Platform Capitalism. I've been thinking about this topic for such a long time that seeing a book that delves deeply into it, and directly into it, I should say, because a lot of books sort of tiptoe around it, if that makes sense, almost felt too good to be true at first. So as the title suggests, this is a book about truth, right? About how to think about nature, how to think about environmentalism, how to think about climate change, obviously, specifically in our current contexts of so-called post-truth, in quotation, and also that post-truth mediated by platform capitalism. And that last bit is why I've been enjoying the book so much, because often, or a lot of the headlines, articles, books even that have come out on so-called post-truth, especially since Brexit Trump, right, when the interest kind of came back on that, tended not to focus too much on the latter bit of platform capitalism. They may blame the big companies, social media companies, but they don't kind of give it that other name. So just in case listeners might not be familiar with some of the terms that I just used, Would you mind just starting us off by presenting your book, the general arguments behind it?
Yeah. So the truth about nature might sound like a relatively arrogant title, right? But I mean it very serious in the sense that clearly a lot of people, and I would include myself there as well, and perhaps yourself as well, Joey, are very concerned about the global environmental sort of crisis that we are in, that we are facing several interlocking crises around climate change, biodiversity, ocean acidification, and what have you. And at the moment where this is becoming a truly global crisis of incredible proportions, we are going through a so-called post-truth crisis. And of course that is a problem that for many feels incredibly personal, incredibly like a major responsibility on their shoulders, right? Particularly those that see themselves as tasked with understanding the rest of nature, but also saving it, right? And I mean, we can come and talk a little bit about like the connotations to saving nature and all that a little bit later on. But of course there's a huge amount of people, conservationists, environmentalists, and others who feel this kind of responsibility. And the one thing I that in my other work as well is I take that very seriously. I might disagree with certain tactics, or I might disagree with certain ways of presenting the rest of nature and all that, but clearly they are in a conundrum that is incredibly painful, right? They and I feel like we really need to do something about this, and hence one of the key strategies has been to then in the face of post-truth to kind of shout the truth off of like all the rooftops and every possible medium that you can possibly find in perhaps more and more hectic language. I mean, some are using terms like biological annihilation or other catastrophic language in order to get attention, which does really well on algorithms and on platforms. So clearly, platforms, digital platforms like Facebook and Twitter, TikTok, and others, have become sort of megaphones for many people to try to do that. And in the process, a lot of people, and I'm quite astonished, but many more progressive people as well think that these platforms in some way or another allow them to have, allow them to talk to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world then notices. I mean, that can happen, but the reality of platforms is such that both the power structure behind it and the way they actually work out in practice is antithetical to not just spreading ideas around truth, but actually having good conversations, right? A meaningful understanding between different people, and more broadly, trying to come to a deeper understanding of certain things that allow you to take particular forms of political action, right? Many people actually think of social media engagement as a form of political action, which it can certainly be and often is, but the effect of which is often sort of taken for granted, right? It's often seen, I have so many likes, I have so many clicks and so many shares, and hence apparently this has been effective. But one of the key points I think I'm trying to make in the book is that building on work by others, obviously, particularly Nick Srnicek's work, but also Shoshana Zuboff and others, is that platforms, the way they operate, actually undermine any idea about truth and shared and joint understanding. And this basically relates to the kind of commercial model that make them so profitable, right? And this is what I, based on Nick Srnicek's work, call platform capitalism. So in very short, I mean, this term is critical for the book. But platform capitalism relates to a mode of capitalism, right? A sort of a reorganization of capitalism, if you will, whereby increasing amount of things that are happening in the world and that we do in our lives are mediated by platforms. And the simplest way I think I can sort of explain that is a sort of literally a medium in between. So if you want to go somewhere, do something, find out something or the other, the idea is that you must go through these platforms, right? So they literally, I mean, we all know this from Google, right? They want to be in between us and the rest of everything that we do. If we want to go somewhere, we go through Google Maps. We want to search anything, we Google it. It's become a verb. And if we want to see how we're doing as a scholar, then Google Scholar, also provides us with those possibilities. Now, Google has a particular sort of way in which they operationalize this platform. Amazon does that in relation to consumer goods. Facebook does it more in relation to, like everything, but like more in sort of the friends and family sphere, or right, social connections and all that. Twitter is more sort of short messaging and all. I mean, we all know this, but they all have the different sort of way in which they try to do that. But they all they all work according to the basic platform model. Right? Airbnb sits in between those who want to stay somewhere and those who want to rent something, and they basically take off rent on the one hand. That's what makes them so profitable. But on the other hand, they through doing so, they can collect incredible amount of data, right? Big data that allow them to better understand the people that are on the platforms and actually start directing them according to other interests, that they themselves may have started developing over the course of their organizational existence and in relation to other commercial interests. And that's exactly what we've seen happening, right? That's not an argument that I necessarily make in my book, but that's an argument that Shoshana Zuboff and others have been making, that I take, that I've also seen in my work, in my research, I mean, that I take as a starting point for basically conceptualizing the other key term, post-truth, somewhat differently than I've seen a lot in the literature. So like what you were saying, Joey, I was also quite frustrated at times by, the way that post-truth was conceptualized, both in broader public debates and even also in the literature. And I give a bit of a summary of that in the book, but in short, in the public domain, it's often sort of seen as emotions coming into politics or those kind of things. And very often in the literature, what's also happening is that it's basically not really seen as something different from lies or bullshit. So I'm trying to be as clear as possible in the book and saying that for me, post-truth, right, is something quite new and directly relates to the power of platform capitalism. Right? In fact, I define it as an expression of power under platform capitalism. Why? Because for me, it's literally post. I take the post very, very literally. It's beyond truth in that the truth doesn't matter anymore. If you want to pursue your environmental goals on Facebook, go ahead. Facebook will give you the platform. If you want to pursue your love for oil or your love for, anything that's anti-environmental, go ahead. Facebook will, facilitate you in exactly the same way and leeches off you in exactly the same way. Right, and gets rent from that and actually makes a lot of money through those kind of processes. And that basic element means that the stronger, I mean, and I'm trying to say this rather bluntly perhaps, but the stronger platform capitalism becomes, the more any idea of truth actually becomes impossible. Right? So trying to shout the truth about nature, about our environmental crisis from the rooftops through social media, right, is actually, doesn't do much for the environmental crisis, but it, actually kills the truth in the process as well. And so we have a double tragedy on our hands. Now, the way to maybe counter this is to revalue and rethink about what it means that truth actually is. right? To actually, and this was a process for me as well, because like so many other scholars, I've kind of been brought up and became more intellectually active during the very dominant sort of postmodern and deconstructionist kind of constructionist kind of movements and all that. And I've always been, like interested on the one hand, also somewhat skeptical from a more sort of, historical materialist perspective. But did take, I never had a need for myself to really think through the idea of truth, and kind of took Latour's prompt, rather sort of as a straightforward given, right? That it was mainly something that you use to give, your opinions extra power. But upon reading Foucault some more, particularly the last lectures that he gave before he died, and literally one of the last lectures that he gave before he died, he actually talks about the courage of truth. That, in his famous way of saying it, truth is always power. But he also talked that it can't go beyond the very specific hegemonic forms of power at specific times and places. And I was intrigued by that, and so I think the way to actually tackle this is to, something that I feel that I've done my whole academic career, is to study power, try to understand power in order to transcend it, and in order to challenge it. And so speaking truth to power is really central in any political endeavor. But then you must be able to say something truthfully about power, right? And that this is a very interesting, like tension, obviously, that I try to embrace wholeheartedly in the book. I actually refer to my sort of approach under the term truth tensions, that we must always speak truth to power at the same time as we must always interrogate truth claims. We must always do both at the same time. And that for me also means interrogating the power behind platform capitalism, right? And that very understanding for me personally has been very helpful. And why I wrote the book is I hope that it will also be helpful to others to try to understand what kind of sort of power this is, how it relates to truth and nature, and what we can hopefully do to maybe try to confront it, and to make our broader politics in relation to environmental questions a bit more effective.
Right. Thanks a lot. This is basically an amazing summary of the book, and so we can kind of unpack this step by step, if that's okay. One aspect of it is, and I have a quote here, that sharing truth about nature through online new media, these big platforms that we're talking about, to counter post-truth has the unintended effect of reinforcing the structural dynamics responsible for the environmental crisis, end quote. I want us to get into this a bit more, so I'll just ask you if that's okay to explain what that means, or maybe give an example if that helps. Mm-hmm. And I'll sort of then maybe respond by giving a bit of my own thoughts, because I definitely agree, and I think it even goes beyond it even goes beyond talking or thinking about climate change, because we're seeing this really throughout the board.
Yeah, I mean, very basically, much of my work has been trying to interrogate the relation between environmentalism and conservation and capitalism. And I've come to the conclusion that in one way or another, we need to move beyond capitalism in order to meaningfully tackle the environmental crisis. So, that also means trying to continue to understand how capitalism morphs, evolves, changes, and transforms, because it is a very dynamic system, right? And not everything within it is necessarily bad or evil. Certainly not people that are trying to make a living, right? So it is, a crazy beast if ever there was one, but thoroughly uneven, and something that is continuously changing. And so this new iteration of platform capitalism takes capitalism to at least from an historical perspective, I would argue, a logical next step, right? Where sort of the long road that capitalism has been through since the 1920s, where it increasingly started focusing on a political economy of the sign, right, whereby advertising, commercial imperatives, commercial advertisement became more important in order to convince, society, workers, that they also needed to be consumers, right? So Baudrillard and many others, of course, have written about all of this very effectively, and that is kind of this, I would say, the start of what we are currently seeing in extremis, namely that value is increasingly not embodied in directly in the production process or the products themselves, but increasingly in sort of the values that they sort of embody and the branding and marketing around that, right? You can also refer to that as speculative capitalism or whatever, and that kind of speculation and the forms of communication that go with it have been elevated to another level under platform capitalism, really by allowing these platforms to sit in between every producer and every customer, every person and everything that they want to do in life. And that inter-between position is incredibly powerful, right? Especially when they become so big that you can't ignore it, right? Most companies don't feel that they can ignore Facebook. They can be outside of Twitter. They somehow need to, and conservation organizations the same thing. And so that kind of incredible power, but a power based on rent seeking on the one hand, and on free floating communication and branding yourself, incessantly and always on the other hand, right, is a very, I think, logical but also quite dangerous phase of capitalism that we're currently in. And so if that is the case, and if capitalism itself remains highly environmentally unsustainable, then promoting the truth about nature on platforms and not actually also trying to see how these platforms themselves need to change is a contradiction to the environmental movement and the environmental goals more generally.
Yeah, for sure. And as I mentioned, like this, it happens across the board. As someone who's been in journalism on and off for a long time now, of course, this has become a story that everyone knows of how it is almost impossible to be a journalist today without having some kind of online presence. And obviously, it has creeped into academia as well in recent years.
Yeah, totally.
And this is really across the board, of course. And I'm someone who, and I've mentioned this a number of times, I'm reluctantly on Twitter, and it's something that I've noticed because I used to have a big Facebook page for at the time, my blog. And when I deleted the Facebook page because I couldn't handle being on Facebook anymore, traffic to the blog pretty much collapsed almost overnight.
Yeah.
And this just became and of course I knew that this was going to happen, which is why I postponed making that decision for like a year or even a year and a half or something. And it's one of those things where almost everyone who's on Twitter, almost anyone, knows that there's something wrong with it, knows that there's something unhealthy about it. If someone who isn't on Twitter asks someone who's on Twitter, should I join Twitter? We almost always tell them no. And yet we're all on it, or at least a lot of people are on it, of course. And I've been in that situation. A good friend of mine asked, should I be on Twitter? And I told them, no, there's no need, unless your job forces you, in which case I can't do much about it. But if you still have that kind of choice, treasure it. But it's true, it really is. And it got to the point where I have this dilemma all the time. And as you mentioned, of course, the reason why it is a dilemma is that sometimes it has a good side, right? If it was always only negative, we wouldn't be having these conversations. And in fact, the reason why we are having this conversation is that it feels like we're forced to have some kind of Faustian bargain with it. Like, we give a bit and then it gives us a tiny bit more, but then we give so much more, etc., etc. And then or at least the way it's been presented in recent years, is that, well, this is the cost of modern communication, right? Like we have to give a bit, or a bit in quotation, of course, and then we get so much in return. But I suppose the difficulty is in the everyday moments. That becomes so.
Yeah.
Fires are happening in Greece, right? Happened a couple of weeks ago. There was a very dramatic video, right, of people on the coast, and they were on the boat and they were filming. And there is the urge to share this. And in the moment itself, the pros of sharing it always outweigh the cons of sharing it, right? There's this kind of a fight against,
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it. Some feel like a fight against time sometimes. Like it's an immediate thing, and we need to even if we have issues with Twitter in the long term, and that's how I end up thinking. We have to do it now, but then obviously the now gets extended and extended and extended, and several years down the line, we're still having the same kind of patterns in our thoughts. And I've seen this on Twitter, I've seen this on Instagram, I've seen this on Facebook. TikTok is like a whole different beast in itself in some ways because of the speed of things, and in fact that's all videos and so on. But one thing that I enjoy in the book, you speak about attention, right? And maybe this is more Twitter or the Facebook, there's a bit of that as well. Attention between doom and gloom, right? And quote unquote being optimistic when it comes to thinking about climate change. And I'll try and emphasize this as much as I can, mostly just to remind myself in this conversation, but maybe listeners, it will help them as well, that we're talking specifically about thinking about climate change, thinking about the environment, thinking about all of nature, thinking about all of these things, and also trying to do something about it, right? It's not just passively consuming information, quote unquote, but trying to do something about it. And the problematic or the difficult thing is that right now, the doing something about it is dominated by what we're calling platform capitalism. So I wanted to emphasize that because often if we don't think about it as platform capitalism, then it's just another platform. Then it's something more neutral about it, something more innocent about it. And then if you're the one coming with your anti-social media perspective, you can sort of feel like you're anti-technology, right? You can sort of be seen as you're just anti-technology, you don't like modernity, whatever that means, etc., etc. And you get caged into a category that doesn't really fit in, quote unquote, the modern world. So what do you think about this tension, if you can talk a bit about like the doom and gloom and being optimistic when it comes to climate change, specifically in the context of sharing, on social media and so on?
Yeah, so both of these obviously have been around for a long time, right? If you read the historical literature on environmental change, you can literally trace both of them back to the 19th century and perhaps even earlier. Certainly since the start of the sort of more modern conservation movement, it's always been a difficult sort of balance, right? Do you need to show the urgency of the moment, right? Where like you said, right? The forest is on fire now. The last of some of the species are disappearing now, right? Like there is this incredible sort of urgency with particular environmental crises that sort of relate quite well with the urgency and the immediacy of social media platforms, right? That we see now, and the need to share this so quickly.
Sorry, just to interrupt you, because it's a very good point if we can just pin this a sec, because there are the wildfires, right? And this is immediate, it's burning now, right? And species extinction, we can sort of picture it as like, X amount of species dying in a week or whatever. But there are these other factors of the environmental crisis that feel more slower, or feel slower, mm-hmm. or feel smaller, even like the disappearance of insects or I don't know, other examples I can think of it, even the melting of the ice sheets and so on. It feels smaller, and it doesn't get the same amount, it doesn't resonate in the same way as social media, because it's not necessarily visually striking all the time, right? Sorry, I interrupted you, but I wanted to also mention that.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and that has to do to some degree with the spectacularization that happens, through social media, right? So as the Boer, of course, taught us in the society of the spectacle, right? The spectacle is not just something big, glamorous that draws a lot of attention. It of course, it's that too, but it's also literally the mediation of relationships through imagery, right? Through forms of communication, discourse, and particularly images, right? And so striking images, right? And this is almost a truism these days, right? Like many progressive, professors as well try to yeah, but I try to do it in pictures because then people really understand. And the question, of course, is do that. I mean, yes, pictures can be very, very powerful, right? But they don't always say more than 1,000 words, right? Sometimes you need the 1,000 words to actually get into some depth of things, because, right, they only give a particular surface interpretation of a much sort of more layered kind of reality behind it, right? And you never really see that layered reality behind it unless you, of course, try to do research on that and really go into that. But it's almost impossible, right? If you see, on your Facebook, wall. And by the way, I deleted my Facebook quite recently as well. The book was out, and I thought, that's it, I'm done. Right? I don't need to be on here anymore. I can't handle this anymore. So I deleted it.
Congratulations! It's an amazing feeling.
It feels great. Yeah. Now my Twitter knows still, and then then we're getting somewhere. But at least the Facebook is gone. But on our Facebook, timelines or Twitter or whatever, right? You're caught in between Greek forest fires, like a dog falling over of a wall in Argentina, right? A lion being shot in an illegal hunt in Botswana, and elephants being mistreated in India, like all in the same, like half a minute. And you can become very angry about that. But the thing is, how do you know where certain things come from and not, right? And that gets often, not always, but often completely lost, especially on Twitter, because it goes so quickly and it's out there. So yeah, it is easier to see the more dynamic stuff and to lose track of how A, they are connected, and B, how they lead to slower, more structural and gradual change over time, things that connect and build up. And for that, you need the 1,000 words. You need the broader theory and thinking that connects disparate elements, into something, holistic that makes sense. And for me, that has always been political economy, right? As the central sort of, and especially the political economy of capitalism, because that's what we live in. But if we would live in another political economy, I think you would still need to look at that, because a lot of power resides in that. But again, you should also try to, be a little bit careful that, I would say, because relating everything to it has its pitfalls as well. But since it is the dominant hegemonic system, it helps me a lot to try to bring these disparate elements together, and also perhaps not get too caught up in the moment. Because the whole point about Twitter and all that is, I mean, our minds become capital in a particular way, right? Capital, for me, very simply put, literally based on Marx and many other scholars, is putting forth value in order to make more values, value in motion, value in process. It is that everything worth something must circulate faster and faster and faster. So products, of course, need to, like we've created enormous shipping and all these kind of routes, in order to get everything, just in time. Or, thankfully now with the Corona crisis, but also that boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal. All of a sudden we realize, oh crap, when I press on the button on Amazon, it doesn't actually magically appear out of thin air. It actually had to be brought somewhere, and all of that, right? And there's labor relations, and all of a sudden that layeredness then hits us, right, back with a vengeance. Behind all these things are all these layers. But the micro experiences that we have on Twitter allow us to not really make a lot of sense in that, and maybe then coming back, because there are literally micro experiences all over the place, and if you don't have a theory that connects them, you become the ping pong ball in between all those things, boing boing, between the forest fire and the mistreated elephant, between this, that, or the other, between what your friends expect from you and all that. And all of that is fantastic for Facebook, because we circulate our minds on Twitter and Facebook like there's no tomorrow, right? We become circulating value for them, right? That spins literally out of control, right? So a key to deal with that, right, is on the one hand to develop, in the capitalist mode of way of thinking, is to develop your marketing strategy, right? Namely, making things really catastrophic so that you draw attention, right? Doom and gloom, or actually being very positive, right? So Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who I draw quite a lot on in my recent work and also in the book, really talks about this as a key element of contemporary society, right? That is actually about positivity, that we all need to brand ourselves the whole time and show like, oh, great. And you see this with, I'm sure with friends as well. I see this with people that I know, writing tweets like, oh, excited this, oh, great this, oh, look at me this, and blah, blah, blah. And he says it's a particular form of narcissism, right? Right, by way we constantly need to, expose ourselves. We need to circulate ourselves, and we feel that is the only way to literally be part of a kind of global conversation through which we get recognition. And we do, right? The more likes you get, the more recognition you feel. But he says you don't actually hear the other. You hear yourself more than anything else, because you're constantly zooming out in order to get these likes and this reinforcement, right? There's no negativity of actual otherness in that. And if there is, you can quickly dismiss it as some silly people that, that you need to, attack, which is what happens on Twitter as all the time as well, of course. And so the positivity of exposing yourself as capital the whole time, this is from Byung-Chul Han, right, has a direct consequence that you burn yourself out literally from the inside, right? You become constantly caught up in this anxiety of you need to be online, you need to be present in order to do that. But like you said, literally yourself, you see that it works to some degree, because traffic can then be directed in particular ways. But you also, in the process, burn yourself out. You wear yourself out. You optimize yourself to death, is his terminology. And the only way to actually deal with that is to literally figuratively, with your mind, with your body, take a step back and at some point say no more, right? And there's only a few who can do that while remaining on Twitter. I'm seeing whether I can somehow deal with that or not. But most of us find that incredibly difficult, right? And I think that's where environmentalists get a double anxiety going, right? They already have this anxiety, this huge pressure of the environmental crisis. And then on top of that, there's the anxiety that you get by staying abreast of all the things that are happening on social media in order to respond to that and be part of it and thinking that is effective. But yeah, so my my argument is that it's not.
And I think a lot of people, or more people definitely than before, know this now, or at least feel this, right? It's a bit everywhere. It's become almost too obvious to even point out, although I do think we need to always point it out and put words to it, to this phenomenon. I've noticed that, and it's more like a personal experience, that, for example, I don't have social media on my phone, and I'm only on Twitter anyway. But with the exception of when there's an emergency in Lebanon and I feel that there is something that I need to check immediately, I would, and when that happens, I would download it on my phone again and then uninstall it immediately after. Other than that, it's become simply too much. And I've always asked myself, or I've been trying to ask myself, why is it too much? And so I went down a rabbit hole at some point in the past year or two of trying to understand how does the algorithm work. And of course, we don't exactly know because they don't tell us, but we can infer a lot. And what does it mean when you can go on Twitter analytics and tells you engagement and views and whatever other buzzwords they use? What do these things mean? And the thing about engagement, and I was having a conversation with a Lebanese activist like last week, as it happens, on this, and I was telling her that not to reply to trolls and not to quote unquote engage, and I use that term before kind of withdrawing and being critical about that as well with those trolls. And there was a sense from her perspective that she doesn't want to give them the satisfaction that they're winning, right? And so she responds to them. But then I sort of explain what I've started understanding about what engagement actually means on social media. And in that specific context of trolling, I'm not talking about a disagreement, I'm talking about an actual trolling situation. The only person that would quote unquote win isn't even the troll, it's just the platform.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the platform, it's like a gambling house, the house always wins. Yeah. At the end of the day, regardless of whether I tweeted something that is quote unquote useful and it got 10,000 retweets. As far as Twitter is concerned, that is the exact same thing as if I had tweeted complete bullshit, complete misinformation, and it also got 10,000 retweets.
Exactly.
It's the same thing essentially.
Exactly.
And though putting it in those terms, that's when people start, I think, realizing more and more that the things that they're using are not neutral platforms. That it's like it's alive in some sense. It's also it's acting upon you, and it's doing so at a speed that most of us can't really comprehend because, of course, it's computer generated. And this is when I start seeing that it creates some pause, right? It creates some kind of sense that because the implications are pretty overwhelming at times, because it's like you have to accept that you may have spent the past decade of your life, on this thing or this app or this website, whatever, for a long time, and a significant percentage of that past decade. And in some ways, you were also at the same time being played, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
because
absolutely, yeah.
There's a reason why it works at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, I see a lot of even colleagues I really, really respect sort of saying that they engage on discussions on Twitter as a form of social outreach, as a form of outreach, outside of the ivory tower. And look, these things are never black or white, right? If there's one thing that I've noticed, I mean, sure, you can maybe convince somebody somewhere, and something positive can come out of that. But the overarching way in which this is taken up by those platforms is one of complete and utter indifference. And not just that is the one aspect, and I think you're very right in pointing that out. But of course, if you look at this as a form of power that is also part of a much broader, more historical, like structure of power and political economy of capitalism, it also integrates itself into much broader tendencies that have been going on for longer and further intensifies those. There are many, right? The one I mentioned earlier is that it further alienates us from nature, that it further stimulates a particular consumerist economy that clearly we see all around us is not good for the rest of nature, etc. But another thing that it does is to further accelerate ideas about time and temporality. It becomes addictive in very particular ways, as though your being indeed is literally caught up in this kind of platform and system, and you don't know how to get out of that. I mean, literally, it is in that sense kind of an addiction, and Byung-Chul Han says that it's not for nothing that scrolling works a bit like a slot machine, right? You have to push down in order to see things rolling, and then put new messages, new things. It goes on forever. It never really stops.
It's by design,
right? And anything that is worth anything is worth pausing for, is worth actually being in silent awe for. The greatest things actually don't need so many words oftentimes, because they're expressed in so many other ways, right? That you can never do on Twitter. And we all know this. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, and Twitter and social media have hyper accelerated that, right? In a way that becomes both addictive and structurally creating a structural sort of stranglehold on politics, on society, on the relations between people, with each other, between companies and their consumers, etc., etc. And we feel that internally, right? All of us do. We, like you say, but it is now part of this structural element that you can only tackle if you fight it, by fighting the structure behind it, right? And thankfully there are people who are doing that, right? Not just kind of post-capitalist people like myself, but I mean there's one guy in the United States who was one of Mark Zuckerberg's old mentors and wrote a book called Zucked, ZUCKAAD, something subtitled like how Facebook is destroying society or something or the other. Because he also realized like what he himself also made money of is actually destroying society from the inside out, right? By creating complete utter distrust between people, by creating a nichified society where everybody has its own particular niche, and they become echo chambers and all that. And with more and more information flying around, we understand the world less and less. And that is the current phase that we are in, and through which we need to confront a myriad other crises, right? Not just the environmental crisis, but we are talking today when just Kabul was taken over by the Taliban, and many other places ongoing, and where continuing incredible forms of imperialism and racist politics continue to really structurally and in so many parts of the world create enormous disparities and suffering. And so to say that doesn't make it any easier is of course a bit of a silly thing to say, but obviously it doesn't, and it deserves our attention in a particular way. And a key contradiction in all of that is that the very medium doesn't allow us to give it that particular attention. So for me, writing the book was a cathartic process for myself to allow my own like feelings exactly the way you described it, and exactly the way that you described it. I think many other people, right? That you think many other people. Maybe not everybody can or should write a book about it and start tweeting about it, of course, but I have found that taking a step back and getting into and really sort of centrally trying to understand what is this dynamic that's changing, what is the power structure behind it, and what does it try to do, already gives me quite a lot of initial peace of mind to try to at least come to a strategy. Then I can try to deal with it. Like you say, it's no longer on your phone. For me, exact same thing. Right? I don't do it on my phone. There's no push buttons on my phone anymore. All of that is out. Right? I that drives me freaking nuts. I can't handle those kind of things. Emails. I try to limit my times, trying to see, when emails come in and try to respond to those. And I've actually shifted, which I find an interesting shift, but maybe that's also just because I'm a nerd, but that I don't read that many articles anymore. I'm reading more and more bigger books, because I feel that really sort of now quenches my own sort of longing for more depth, that which is the opposite of the often silliness on Twitter. So maybe it's also a coping mechanism or something. I don't even know myself. But that those moments make me more relaxed, composed, and able to strategize in a way that allows you to deal with all of this. And it pains me, and I dread to think about what people do in order, if they don't have these kind of mechanisms, or don't build these mechanisms, and actually allow themselves to be this ping pong ball in between, within the Twitter sphere. I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, for me, I also think of it in the sense that, so as I said, I've been going through this process of thinking a lot about technology and my or social media specifically, in my place within it. But I still need to pace myself essentially at times. In the sense that I used to have Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and I felt that was too much to think about, and so I deleted Facebook and Instagram. I deleted Instagram twice actually. I then reinstalled it at some point 2 years ago, and then I re-deleted it a few months later. Um, and now because I'm only in this one on this one platform, essentially, it allows me to manage my thoughts a bit better, but or my time on it a bit better, but not always. Like I still
Yeah.
find myself feeling or going through some what I would essentially like kind of falling in the trap in some sense. And now I'm much better at it in the sense that, for example, I just have rules in my mind that I figure that I will not violate these rules unless absolutely necessary, essentially. So I don't respond to trolls. That's a golden rule, and I block people who are abusive and whatnot. That's another golden rule. And I also don't necessarily quote unquote engage at all, with the exception of when I feel this is just someone that I know and I'm doing it there. But even then, so basically what I'm trying to say is that there are certain mechanisms that I have put in place. I have a blog, for example, just with joeayub.com, and sometimes if I feel like I want to have a Twitter thread, I ask myself, well, can I just do a blog post instead? And often the answer is yes, and so I would then do a blog post. But I don't always think about it. Sometimes the habit takes over, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I'm saying all of this also to say that it took me a lot of time. I had the space, the mental bandwidth for it. I'm very privileged. I have, I'm doing a PhD. I have certain resources at hand. I can access most books that I can think of. Most people don't have those kinds of resources. And it's become something where I think of many countries where when you buy a phone and you want internet on the phone, it is just Facebook. That counts as the internet, and you can pay um, a certain monthly payment or whatever that is just for Facebook. You don't even have a browser. Your browser becomes Facebook,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
think we know how bad that is.
yeah.
But
Myanmar, that was one of the issues, right?
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
And so, and for some people this is like an extreme example, but it really isn't. It's just an example where you have even fewer safety nets that
yeah,
maybe I would have taken for granted otherwise, if you see what I mean.
yeah, yeah.
And related to this, or going back to the point that we're talking about, of the sense that I want to do something about something, right? Like I want, it's really bad in Kabul right now, and we know this, of course. As it happens, we're speaking on what is it, August 16th, a day after the Taliban took over Kabul, and it's basically ongoing, and it's gonna probably be ongoing for a long time. Um, we see horrific images and horrific videos already of desperate people trying to flee, and we know already we're talking about like Afghans not being allowed to go to the UK or whatever because of stupid visa issues and bureaucratic issues and so on and so forth. And there is this sense, and maybe this is one of those examples where it may make some difference, right? There is this sense that if you make enough of a noise about it, maybe let's say Boris Johnson feels the pressure to do something about it because he might think that this is good for his image or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
As it happens in this case, I'm not gonna talk too much about it because I'm not sure. It's basically still ongoing, but there may have been a situation where this has gotten some positive
Yeah.
consequences because maybe they are now allowed, some of them at least, to get easier access to visas and whatnot in some contexts. So there is this sense, and because I guess the trick is that because we almost never know whether quote unquote engaging on social media will produce a good outcome, which goes back to the slot machine, obviously, metaphor, because and many people have also of course spoken about how the slot machine has been integrated within social media algorithms. The entire point, and this is something I didn't really understand until I started reading up about it, that you have to lose a lot for the slot machine to function. You have to always feel that maybe next time, maybe next time, maybe next time. That's sort of the entire point.
Yeah, yeah,
And from time to time someone will win. The trick is that the number of times that someone wins is tiny compared to the number
Yeah,
of times that the house wins, which is why we
yeah,
of course have the slogan of like the house, or the expression of the house always wins. And it's
yeah,
sort of the
yeah,
same on social media.
yeah,
The Afghanistan example may be an example where some people may be saved or helped or what have you, not necessarily because of it, but maybe partly because of you being on social media. But then you
yeah,
have all of the other examples in which not only does it make no difference, but it's actually taking time away from very crucial time, if you see what I mean, from what we need to
yeah,
otherwise be doing. And
yeah,
this is the
yeah,
trick. And I don't have an answer to it. I don't think anyone has one answer to it. But I think it's very important to understand that this is a problem, i.e., that this isn't
yeah,
a neutral platform. We're thinking about Twitter,
yeah,
but all of the others as well, of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I would, I mean, I think there are three critical issues here in relation to what you're saying, and I think it's really, really important. The first is in relation to individual responsibility, right? Do you as an individual have the resources to cope with these kind of structural power dynamics in a way that allows you to stay sane? I think in one way, inevitably, everybody that's on these things needs some kind of strategy, right? You can't just go give yourself all over to it and survive as as a normal human being. So people, I think everybody does have some kind of strategy. Some are perhaps more effective than others. Um, some have a broader sort of context in mind that allow them, that help them to make sense of this. Um, but these things are so addictive that if you just surrender to them completely, um, that might be completely dire. And of course, when people then lose, partners or work, I mean, people get fired over this because they spend so much time on platforms, right? You see that it has consequences. But this, of course, is also very typical of the way that neoliberalism, capitalism works, and lays responsibility for structural problems with individuals, right? We all individually need to sort out how we deal with this. But in the meantime, structurally, the problem, deepens. So we can't run away from it. We always have to sort of try to keep ourselves motivated to try to not succumb to it. That is very, very tiresome, right? That's incredibly tiresome. That wears all of society out. And you can see how wary all societies globally are at the moment. And this, kind of power is not an insignificant part of that. Not the only, but not an insignificant. That is the first one. Second element is that you then have to look indeed at the structural element behind it, and to realize it's not just about communication, right, in relation to Twitter or social relations, in relation to Facebook and blah, 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 blah. But it goes much, much, much further, right? Airbnb, renting taxis, like Uber and all that. But indeed, as you said, for example, also in academia, right? Elsevier, right, is a horrible, horrible publishing company, partially coming from my, my own country, the Netherlands, who not only take an insane amount of private profit directly from public purses by, getting free, labor from academics and then selling it back to them with for a lot of money through university library subscriptions and all that. But now, right, it's being turned into platform, like all these things. Now you first need to pay, and then you can publish so-called open access, but a lot of articles are, in the same amount of money. So it creates immediate inequalities amongst researchers. And second of all, it becomes a platform model whereby all kinds of forms of data are integrated to tell you if you're interested. Oh, you're interested in Lebanon and post-capitalism. Oh, you should read this article. Oh, you should read that article. And the structural pressures that you experience on the Twitter you try to deal with now come in your work as an academic, but not just in your work, but people in taxi industries and in the hospitality industries and all other industries know everything about this. In fact, all of us are ranked now on a daily basis. How was your interaction with your teacher, right? Like all of us are constantly have to worry about whether we don't get ranked on platforms that do that. So that is a much more structural effect in which platforms and platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism, or however you want to call it, is changing the way that capitalism works, right? How it makes profits and how it turns basically all of us, including those, often those at the top, although, they have the resources to better manage it, into addicts and into, nervous wrecks who need to constantly perform because, they're afraid of the next rating, which is always, tomorrow or the day after. So your horizon also changes. The third element is that you need to relate this particular structural form of power, platform capitalism, to yet others. And this is why, for me, environmentalism is so critical, right? And particularly conservation. Because in the third part of the book, I have some case studies where I do try to show that if there's anything that distinguishes conservation from some of the other sectors, is that they know that it's not about whether you make an online difference, right? Saving an online elephant is not the same as saving an offline elephant. So they know that ultimately the stuff happens in the fields, right? With you need to get your boots dirty in the mud, with actual ecosystems that are not romantic, that it's not easy to work with, and whereby all kinds of other elements come into play. And there, of course, all of this again is even less black and white than some people maybe make it out to be. First of all, in the sense that yes, you can achieve certain things, right? And I show examples of that in terms of putting pressure, for example, back in the day on Dilma Rousseff in Brazil against some kind of law, right? If you can muster it and you can build these campaigns, you can sometimes indeed influence certain things very much, and it does and can certainly happen. But secondly, right, all kinds of other elements like class and race and gender and all kinds of things, of course, also come in there. And it's good to somehow find a way, which I think any good theory of capitalism should do, and I think I said that in the beginning, right? To take the power of these things very, very seriously, but not make them all determining, because they're never all determining. There's always still contingency. There's always still space. And you must also use those spaces, not just to protect yourself, but also build bigger things, right? Vis-a-vis structural power, and to see that others are actually also doing that, right? In terms of platform capitalism, there's platform cooperatives currently being set up. There are other ways to use digital media that, and there's ways where, for example, you can directly attack the structural power of these problems by, for example, looking at loopholes in legal systems, right? In the US, they say that platforms, have editorial responsibility. Like a newspaper can be, made liable for the stuff that comes out in the newspaper. But there's a loophole in US law that, doesn't give Facebook or Twitter the same liability, right? So anything can be posted on their platform and they're never liable, right? Of course, society here has been pushing, back against, right, this sort of free, publish everything under the sun kind of model that they all have, because that's what they profit from, and that's why they're hiring, many people in the Philippines and other places now, to do the awful work of looking at horrible videos and trying to delete it off their platform. I mean, imagine, if you would have to do that. But there are thousands of people actually doing that, and still that's only scratching the surface, because they are themselves in a bind where they are addicted to the growth of more and more users, more and more interactions, and more sort of platform tentacularization, into all kinds of spheres of life and the internet, and trying to mediate it in such a way to still at least look somewhat, politically correct and or decent or civilized, or whatever you want to call it. For many people, it's clear that Zuckerberg, and Facebook are clearly siding, towards the I don't care so much, I just do, enough to try to get away with as much as possible kind of side, whereas others take that maybe a bit more seriously. But there are the structural spaces that I think you can push back on, and this is my call towards conservation organizations. Like, you guys know you don't depend ultimately for your success on the platforms, because ecosystem interactions, right, happen outside these platforms, right? They may depend on them and they may be influenced by them, but there's not a single elephant out there on their own watch on Twitter, right, out of their own accord. And hence, you guys know that there's this quite strong boundary between, right, humans and non-humans in that respect. And you can use that to your advantage to perhaps do two things at once, right? Go, push back against the structural power of post-truth and push back against the structural power of capitalism more generally, to try to mediate the environmental crisis that you say that you care about. And the central thing to do then is, first of all, by saying that we need to move away from growth. Start there, and then all these other things are connected to all that, and start working those kind of things out. So, we have space for this kind of action, but it must always be connected to that broader goal of tackling growth and all that to begin with.
Well, it perfectly kind of segues to the next question I had, which was about these environmental NGOs. I, for like disclaimer, 10 years ago, I was a volunteer with the WWF, and we went to Madagascar for 2 months. And I was very young, so I don't feel I was that useful. I did much. It was a conservation project. The year after is when I started wising up, I should say, because I also went to Peru with another NGO. And there, halfway through, I decided to quit it and to basically backpack through Peru. And the reason why I did that is because it became very clear to me, much more so than the year before, that this really had nothing to do with the project that they were advertising on their website. And that's kind of around that time that I discovered terms like voluntourism and that kind of industry that I was inadvertently, unwillingly, I should say, part of. You go through a lot, it's somewhat related to this, but you go through a lot in the book of examples of environmental NGOs that have spent or are still spending a lot of resources, a lot of money on, hashtag facts of wildlife and online campaigns and petitions and so on and so forth. And again, this isn't to say that none of it is useful, but there's clearly too much being put into it compared to what other sort of actions we need to be taking right now. And some are doing it better. This is kind of a generalizing statement, but it's definitely a trend. And you give the example of conservation 2.0, elephant 2.0, Kruger 2.0, and rhino 2.0. Is it okay? Can I just ask you to expand on some of these examples, if not all of them? Why did you choose these examples, and what do they sort of, what do they evidence? What comes out through these examples?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, a key thing that comes out is that, like I said, I would expect everybody has some kind of strategy. A key argument that I make across these 4 chapters on Rhino 2.0, Kruger 2.0, etc., is that environmental organizations are not dupes of this, right? They also think and strategies in relation to this. They don't just blindly follow platform capitalism in everything, and they struggle with a lot of things in the process, like all of us do. They perhaps may not think about it in terms of platform capitalism or a structural critique of capitalism, which I think is problematic, which I think they should do. But that doesn't mean that many of them don't still have their own theories about how to handle this and not to put too much pressure on people. Where are the limits of your social media engagement? And in fact, there's a lot of money going on in that, right? Like setting up social media strategies. I mean, it's a huge, growth market. It has become a huge growth market. And, there's plenty of consultants that make a lot of money of that. And I actually quote some of them in the book as well. It's become this real, real sort of niche industry within conservation as well. But what I wanted to show with some of these chapters in particular, right, besides that, you know, they're not dupes and they strategize, is also the particular kind of politics that come to the fore when you actually take both platform capitalism seriously and also offline dynamics. So, you know, for example, in the Kruger 2.0 chapter, I go a bit deeper into how social media has been changing, you know, the politics around the Kruger National Park here in South Africa, and one particular aspect is how it allows a particular group of people, you know, and a racialized group of people, namely mostly whites, that have traditionally, of course, literally owned the park, right, under apartheid, and have historically really developed this incredible bond with the park, and still have, right, 75 to almost 80%, you know, of people visiting the Kruger Park are still white. I mean, and the park's authorities here actually keep those statistics, so you can actually check that and see how that is changing. But they want to have this particular relation with a park that is sort of like almost a romanticized space outside of the rest of politics, right, in South Africa, that many of them are tired of, right? And don't like all too much, and they, you know, critique the government all. And here's a space where they can do that, and sort of directly relate to, right, the amazing and abundant and you know, like spectacular natures that you find there, and a platform that allows them to fully zoom in through pictures only on those natures makes it even easier to discard, you know, the layered contexts around them. So my argument that I'm making, sort of in relation to sort of relational literatures and broader sort of, you know, ideas in theory about that, how everything is entangled and all that, I sort of show, yeah, I mean, this allows, right, these whites to be even more entangled and relational to the park through social media. It actually hybridizes the border even more, and at the same time, and that's the central argument in that chapter, it actually fortifies, reinforces the racial boundary that the park is founded on, right? Because not only does it allow whites to create this kind of, you know, relation with the park through these images focused only on animals, right, discarding people, and especially Black people that have historically been dispossessed from the park, but the park is also, you know, neoliberalized, and it commercially depends on the income from these same white people in order to keep itself afloat. So even though it's run by Black people, it doesn't, you know, actually have, you know, the incentive to go against these dominant media representations. They try sometimes, but they know that spectacular animal pictures, you know, without all the troubling, you know, social context, you know, and history of the park, you know, works often much better to attract, you know, tourists and people to the park to spend the money that, you know, they as employers of the park subsequently depend on. So you see, it becomes a, you know, very interesting sort of circle. And the politics that I take from there is what I call politics of distinction. In that, right, in that people try to make sort of distinguish, and I take this from Bourdieu's idea of distinction, right? That across different social categories, class categories, people try to do all kinds of things, you know, to distinguish themselves from others, and they often do the same thing in parks. So like, oh, check it out, I've seen 5 lions. No, but I've seen 10. Oh, but I saw them hunting. Oh, there's endless amounts of ways in which you can interact with animals that allows you to distinguish yourself. But distinguishing yourself as an individual, and this comes back to our discussion that we had about how to deal with social media, right? Distinguishing yourself as an individual also relates to distinctions made in the broader social sphere, right, in society as a whole. And here, these kind of distinctions of really getting this deep connection with the park subsequently also keep a broader distinction, right, a really racialized distinction of the park very much alive. And that is very problematic if you want to structurally transform the park to a more post-apartheid, you know, fitting to a post-apartheid society. So this is one example where I tried to show that the structural elements in relation to platform capitalism, right, relate to specific contexts in very specific and important ways with important consequences, and that you need to connect those two. Yeah, I mean, this took me years of field work and study to of course come to these kind of conclusions, but so many people don't have that. But the one thing you can of course do is to be aware that there always are these layers and to show some interest in that. That's the least you can do, right? Many people often don't even do that, but that, I think particularly when you go to other places, that kind of basic respect of showing interest above and beyond, the first images and things that you see, it's only a very, very, very small step, but that would be an important step to make, particularly when it, for example, comes to wildlife conservation in South Africa and many white tourists coming from the US and Europe.
Maybe a bit of an awkward pivot, but I think it's actually related because in the book, well, I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a more philosophical question, I'm not sure, but a large part of our conversation in general, to some extent, is about the difference between understanding and knowledge. And yourself, you use Hannah Arendt a lot, of course, to explore that distinction. So can you explain that distinction? Because I think it will help us understand why just quote-unquote sharing the facts isn't always, or even most of the time, the most efficient thing to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the way I actually conceptualize and define truth relates to Hannah Arendt's idea of understanding. And she makes a distinction between understanding and knowledge. And I've actually made that into a triad of data, knowledge, understanding. So data for me is like a fact. It's like one particular thing about something, that may be true about something outside of any context, right? About outside of any history and outside of how different people relate to that from their own position. I refer to this as positionality. So a fact is something that for me that can certainly be true, but that, but of course, it all depends on the interpretation, right? How this gets taken up, right? Data points, following Nick Srnicek's works, are also basically, statements about something that happened, right? So if you click on a site, you have been there. Fact, it's a fact, a data point, you've been to that site. So I mean, apparently you are interested in that. Well, then you get advertisements about that, whether it's, whatever, swimming pools or books or God knows what. If you want to try to understand why somebody does that, you get to knowledge. So that's the difference between fact and knowledge, or data and knowledge. And here you need many data points about somebody. You need to understand, a lot of the layers, a lot of the elements, in order to add them up and say, okay, here's, why somebody actually likes it. Oh, I see somebody, likes a particular amount of type of music. Okay, it's because somebody plays an instrument, and, you bring all these things together and you start to understand why somebody, and again, platforms understand this, and they've actually become quite good at this, and that's why they want all of us to spend so much time and complete our profiles, because the more data that they have on us, the more they can connect those dots and create user profiles, right, that relate to societal profiles that they have at the background, like, okay, you're a lefty, or you're a right-wing person, or you're a Trump supporter, or you're an immigrant, or you're right. They literally create, I mean, we don't see that, but they have all kinds of categories that they then link other things to in order to, connect you further to things that might be of your interest, right? With the result that you might end up in particular niches that you don't feel comfortable with at all, and or that don't surprise or challenge you. One step further, so the bare facts, the bare minimum outside of everything, facts or data, trying to get them together on, you get the question why, but that doesn't actually make things meaningful. And that's the key difference between knowledge and understanding, or between, for me, facts and truth, right? If you've been living with a particular community, right, that has, for example, like in relation to my book, been kicked out of a park, and time again, you've found that you're trying to get back your relationship with the land, but you're hindered by this boundary and all the tourism that relates to that. When you grow up, I mean, that becomes so meaningful in both a positive or negative way, but your being is caught up in that, right? And that's what I really mean with things that are meaningful. And that, Hannah Arendt says, relates to translating to particular forms of common sense, right? Things that you sense around you as a human being, and this is where algorithms stop. They don't sense it, right? They try to keep pushing, these algorithms, the people behind them, in order to try to come so close that it's almost freaky. But you can sense from another human being, certain moods or certain other things, right? And then respond to that in particular ways that become meaningful. And this is the scary thing about, but precisely about the phase of platform capitalism that we're in now, because they try to get as far as possible, right? To pretend that they can be as meaningful as humans can be with and to each other. But they can only do that based on more data, based on getting back to bare facts. And there's always this disconnect there. Of course, we humans also depend on facts, right? In terms of your research, you depend on facts and data, right? Babies, when they grow up, they also depend on all kinds of data points that allow them to connect the dots, if you will, right? Connecting the dots literally is the same kind of thing. And then they become meaningful in, for me, three particular ways in terms of the history that they come out of, the context that they are in, and the positionality of different people. And that kind of sense, relating that kind of sense, right, is where real depth is possible. And then it's actually no longer anymore about an outcome, as Arendt says, right? Truth and understanding for her, never stop and never end. Literally, right? It's a lifelong journey, and there's actually pleasure, and there's incredible, power also in getting into that depth, knowing that the outcome is, and this is where it differs from platforms, right? Because they need this particular outcome. They still generate this thing that goes in your, there's no hole in the way that it's represented on a timeline, right? This is why Facebook has been experimenting with these timelines, because they want it to become more intuitive to you, but they can't, because it always is in the end the work of algorithms and the data that supply them that ends up on your list, rather than a person that at some point knows when to shut up and just put an arm around you and say, you know what, it's all fine, the world sucks, or this sucks, or that's good, or that's right. Clearly, algorithms and Facebook can never do that. They actually, in the process, because they come closer and closer, but can never reach that. They actually make the feeling of estrangement and alienation bigger and deeper, and you start searching for that meaning, but you can never get it. And that, is one of the incredible dangers of our time, in a world where meaning, right, and depth already are sort of becoming more extinct and endangered, to give it terms that I often use, because everything should be commodified and can be bought and sold, even partners and people and what have you, right? This takes it again to another level. And so the danger is not only in terms of the environmental crisis, but also a real deep human crisis of alienation that goes with that. And the key is understanding and truth. And that's why we shouldn't give up on those things.
And in some ways, like, if we want to take out like an actionable conclusion in some sense, to sort of wrap up, you write that speaking truth to power, and I have the quote here, is about the art of compressing the understanding that is the basis of truth into common sense kernels that challenge hegemony, end quote. And so it's in some sense like the Hannah Arendt explanation. it's never ending. And it can't ever end by definition, because we always need to understand the latest challenges and the ongoing challenges, not just for ourselves, which is, I guess, step one in many ways, but also try and do something with it. And we do something with it by compressing, as you're calling it, in a way that is also understandable to a wider audience. And that is, by definition, very difficult to do. And we always will have different ways of doing it. And it will always adapt, or at least it will always have to adapt to the latest crisis, but also to the latest platform, some might say. And this changes from platform to platform. Some people will decide that the best way for them is to just stop and no longer be on those platforms, and that's fine. Others who would choose to stay, or who don't have a choice to stay, for them it's going to be a different kind of balancing act in many ways, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It is also a particular kind of politics, right? I regard it as a particular political strategy in relation to this form of power. And right, old labor relations were about, for example, the working day, right? Labor struggles, right? And sort of the sort of immediate aim of factories was to get people to work as long as possible, to exploit them in a maximum way. And this is, in that sense, not so different. In a way, what platform capitalists love is for all of us to spend as much time on it and to be as dumb as possible, right? To be as stupid as possible, so that we keep circulating in an endless fashion without gaining any more meaning, depth, or further understanding. And so and this links also with a real crisis in modern academia, of course, where theory itself is something by some like especially university managers considered not practical, and we should it should all relate to patents and direct societal impact and all that kind of bullshit. But theory, understanding the importance of theory, namely a particular abstraction of the world that allows you to make sense of the world, that allows you to be in the world in a way that is somewhat stable. It always changes, of course. Stability itself is a fallacy, but it at least allows you to ground yourself, to root yourself in a way that allows you to make sense of things, right? That doesn't just require a house, right? A home does that for you in space. But and this is what Byung-Chul actually says, rituals allow you to do that in time. And what I would say, theory allow you to do that in terms of understanding, right? And what platform capitalists, destroy is our sense of time and our sense of meaning, because we think we get meaning from, this narcissistic, marketing of ourselves, trying to get more likes and all that, in a time frame that mingles everything in relation to their algorithmic and needs for commercial interests, rather than our own sense of trying to find ourselves, or trying to help others, or trying to relate to things, or trying to do something meaningful in the world, right? We think we do that, and sometimes it works out in that way, but not necessarily because platforms are interested in that, but because we know how to mediate platforms in such a way that we can still get that done despite the platforms, right? And these are some of the examples that I show in the book, that it does happen. But it's, again, that is not a long-term structural way to move forward, right? Any attempt to address a structural problem needs a more structural solution. And if we only allow us to be seen as customers, or individuals, without a broader society, that all need to reinvent the wheel, and so if you succumb to it, then you are stupid not to organize your phone in such a way that you succumb to it. It's your own freaking fault, right?
It's not the slot machine's fault. It's your own fault, right? It's always your own fault, but it's not, right? And especially with these kind of bigger things, whereby they themselves, don't hold them to their own neoliberal creed of individual responsibility, because they lobby governments like there's no tomorrow, because they know structural power needs to be pushed in their direction and not in a broader direction that is a little bit more environmentally sane, a bit better for our brains, and a bit more socially, equal. And I think it's, trying to capture that in particular moments is what I mean with those kernels, right? You can never say to everybody, I mean, I also felt at some point like, okay, I've written the book now, but yeah, I mean, I was at the end of the book, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people have to be nerds like myself to read the thing. It's not, at least what I've heard from people, it's not the lightest bedtime reading there is, and I fully accept that. And it, I try to make it as really readable as possible, but then again, you can't say to everybody, read the book. That's the silliest thing that you can say. No, you need to from that moment really sort of yourself think through those things, work together with others to organize, and then help each other find, those kind of things that link individual short, kernels to a broader, organized platform for change. And those things are there. There are people doing that. And right, I think the biggest challenge is how to find, other like-minded people and actually make that worth your while, whilst not again succumbing to the same structural forces. So I don't have the answer to that, but that for me is certainly something I'm also struggling with, and I work together literally now in South Africa with friends and colleagues here who are also keen to do that, and that gives me, besides a lot of pleasure in life, it also allows me to deal at least with some of these issues that otherwise would probably drive me completely nuts.
Well, I mean, I totally agree that we can't always ask people to read the book, but we are going to recommend 3 books, and maybe they are going to read these 3 books, who knows. But what are 3 books that you can recommend for our listeners, and just briefly talk about them, if that's okay, to explain why you like these books?
So I mean, these would be in relation to my own book, but like I say in the beginning of my preface, if you want to understand platform capitalism, then I do think Nick Srnicek's books is a fantastic start. It's pretty short, but it does such a crisp job to explain what happened in the changes of capitalism and how it and why that is important. Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is a good book. I know some people, are quite critical of that, including people who have also written about platforms and all that. I'm not 100% sure about her politics in relation to capitalism more broadly. So I think there's some issues there, but what she outlines is some of the issues I think you could still take a lot of. It's in that sense a good read. So that's certainly one thing, that one element. Then a second and a third book. Yeah. So I recently, I mean, this is also related to some of the reading I'm doing now around extinction and the biodiversity crisis, but there is a scholar here in South Africa, Kuljian is her name, last name, and she wrote a book called Darwin's Hunch. That is an incredibly fascinating book. It's about the original hominids, the discovery of fossil, human remains in South Africa and other parts of Africa, and how that changed, from the early 20th century to about now, in the broader sort of apartheid context of South Africa. And I mean, it may seem like it's very South Africa focused, but actually it tells us a much broader story about how we actually came to understand, the sort of long, lineage of the human sort of species, if you will, and how there's not one tree of life but actually what they increasingly started calling a bush of life, which also goes to the incredible diversity in evolution. So, I mean, apparently Darwin was more nuanced about this than I had initially, thought, right? I always took Darwin as a neo-Darwinist, but he apparently is not him. He wasn't himself such a neo-Darwinist as he was later made out to be. In that he himself apparently already understood that there's no one single tree, and that a lot more complex, relations happened in order for the human species to evolve. Now, that whole process of discovery and what that did within the South African context vis-a-vis Europe, right? So the first time somebody came up with that in South Africa, Europeans said, no, that's ridiculous. Humans can't come from Africa. They have to come from Europe, right? These were completely imperial colonial thinking, and that and how that sort of related to scientific evidence comes out wonderfully in that book. So Darwin's Hunch was for me one of the most recent, fantastic reads. And then you want the third one, right?
Well, you mentioned Nix and Shoshana, so that's 1, 2, and the third one is Christa Kuljian's. So I think I can let you off the hook if you don't want to suggest a third or fourth one.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many incredible books.
Of course,
but I would need to think about that for a little more. So maybe for now I'll leave it at that, and then I can always add some more on
Send me
Twitter.
stuff. Yeah, for sure. And I will all of the books that you mentioned, of course, I will include them in the blog post. If you want to send me extra ones, I can always just add them there, and that's fine.
Okay. Well,
thank you a lot for your time. This has been a long but very productive and definitely illuminating conversation, and I really thank you for it.
No, I thought it was wonderful, Joey. Thank you so much for the invitation and for doing this. And let's hope some people may get something from it. That would be cool. And we can continue the conversation.
I'm sure they would. For sure. Thank you a lot.
All right. Take care.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.